I'd like to read to you from the Gospel of Matthew, and it's commonly referred to as the Little Apocalypse. Somewhere around a century to 2 centuries prior to Jesus' birth, the Jewish people began to develop a language that captured both their hope and disappointment for some of the ways they saw the world interacting with them as a people. Their disappointment was that they had worked for and lived their lives as those who expected, anticipated justice in this life. But they also began to recognize that that wasn't always the case. So they began to wonder, well, if God's in control of all this, maybe justice isn't something that always happens here and now, but may well have another freshness date attached to it in the future. So what you had to do was be prepared for both. You had to live as if things were unfolding in the here and now, but that they also may have a future date as well. And some of that may depend on how you react in this life, in your time and place. This is what Matthew wrote. It's from the 24th chapter. Jesus had just left the temple and was going away. His disciples came out and pointed out the buildings. But he answered to them, "You see all these, don't you? Truly I say to you, there will not be one stone left upon another that won't be thrown down." Then he went to the Mount of Olives and he sat down. The disciples took that opportunity to come to him privately. And they said, "Why don't you tell us when all of this will come to pass? What will be the signs of your return, your coming? What will be the signs of the close of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "Take heed that no one leads you astray, because many are going to come in my name, and they'll say, 'I am the Christ.' And they will lead you astray. You'll hear of wars, rumors of wars. You'll see them, but don't be alarmed. For these things will have to take place, but that doesn't mean the end is yet. Nation will rise against nation. Kingdoms, they'll rise against kingdoms. There'll be famines. You'll see earthquakes. All this is just the beginning, like birth pangs. Then they're going to deliver you up to tribulation, and they'll put you to death. You'll be hated by all the nations for my name's sake. And many will fall away, betray one another. People will hate one another. There'll be many false prophets. They'll arise. They'll always lead people astray, and because wickedness has a way of multiplying, you'll see a time when most people's love will grow cold. But the person who endures to the end will be saved. And this very gospel will be preached to all the kingdoms throughout the world. It'll be a testimony to every nation. And then the end will come. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Matthew's account of Jesus' life and times, his ministry, it's written somewhere between 50 and 60 years after Jesus' life, crucifixion, and resurrection. He's writing to an entirely Jewish audience community. It's a synagogue community, and Matthew has taken it upon himself to offer through this account of the life of Jesus stories that he believes may convince, persuade, certainly invite you to consider that Jesus is actually the Messiah. What he's trying to develop in his synagogue is what you and I would probably refer to today as Messianic Jews. Their Jewishness remains, their Yiddishkeit. But they have come to recognize that this first century rabbi from Nazareth of Galilee is the promised one. And to do this, he is constantly reassuring his community that Jesus is very Jewish. He's contrasting over and over again Jesus' life and teaching with Moses. Moses did this, Moses said that, Jesus did this, Jesus said that. He'll lose the argument. And sometime toward the close of the first century, Matthew and his community will be excommunicated from the synagogue. And they'll go and they'll settle in another part of the Palestinian area. But they'll no longer be among these folk that he was trying so desperately to persuade that he's the one. This kind of struggle for the hearts and minds of people will go on for centuries. But in this time of Matthew, for those who could embrace the Messiahship of Jesus, the early church kind of made you go over some hurdles before you could actually call yourself a faithful disciple, even be a disciple, or be among the Christian community that had access to the Lord's table. They knew this wasn't something that you could choose to do easily, because in those days many people were finding that their families would betray them, turn them over to the authorities. Some would end up in colosseums, some would end up being executed, some would end up being crucified. It wasn't something that you chose lightly for you, your wife, and your daughters. If you were thinking of becoming a Christian, a follower of Jesus, you knew what may happen to you and your family. So the early church said, okay, we're going to develop a catechism, things that you're going to have to come to accept and believe about Jesus. And we're going to teach you this, but we're going to teach it to you over a 36-month period of time. And then after those 36 months, if you had catechized me, for instance, and I were to say, I believe that I can be a faithful follower or disciple of Jesus, and I'm committed to that way of life, teachings, style of relating to others, then I would need you to stand and testify on my behalf, saying, I think old Sprouse can pull this off. And then someone else would have to stand up and say, yeah, I've seen him do several acts of charity. He seems to have the kind of compassion, mercy, and ability to forgive that we've come to expect from those who can embrace this tradition of faith. And if you convinced others that I could do this, and if I were persuasive enough, then you would bring me into the faith tradition. You would call me a brother or a sister in Christ. You would allow me access to the table. And then I would try to walk faithfully and humbly with God. But having said all that, most of the time people were concerned with whether or not Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. If I thought that I only had to live this way for a few weeks, a few months, maybe a couple of years at the most, I may be much more willing to commit to that way of living than if you had already convinced me, well, Jesus said that he was coming back very soon, but I've noticed now that Paul and Peter have been martyred in Rome. And I hear that Jesus' mother and father are both deceased. I understand also from other communities that other disciples of Jesus, those who knew him in the flesh and heard him, they've been executed too. I don't know if I can pull this off for 30 years. terms of weeks or months. It's another thing to think in terms of the rest of my life. And so the Christian community began to wonder when Jesus was going to return, and they developed all sorts of formulas for it. After about 1,000 years in the 10th century, in the year 999, Pope Sylvester was thinking that at the very stroke of midnight, when 999 becomes 1000, that's a great opportunity for Jesus to return. And so he had everyone gather in a cathedral around an altar on New Year's Eve. And the church bells began to toll the hour, midnight. 1, 2, 3. It's time to repent of your sins. 4, 5, 6. Could be any minute now. We'll be gone. 7, 8, 9. Take hold of the hands of those kiddos. You don't want to go without them holding on to you. 10, 11, 12. And his hands were still in the air. And so are ours. So he looked at the congregation and he said, well, God has chosen to spare our lives for another year. Thanks be to God. The early apostles really were caught up in just how long it would be before God just rearranged the fabric of the whole world and made it into the kingdom of God. And Jesus, in a sense, gave them a word of caution. He said, as for that, when I return, it'll be like a thief in the night, not a robber. Now, his audience knew exactly what he meant when he distinguished between a robber and a thief. A robber was someone who really didn't always plan things out, but you could be traveling a road from Jerusalem to Jericho or the other way, and a robber just simply saw you coming and said, hey, that looks like a sap, and goes over there and holds up a stone or whatever it is and just robs you. Has no regard for the law, isn't afraid of anything or anyone. But Jesus doesn't describe it that way. Jesus says that when he returns, he'll come like a thief in the night. Now here's what a thief does. A thief does a stakeout. A thief watches when you come and go. A thief knows when you're home, when you're not. A thief has already determined where you keep all your treasures, where your valuables are. When Jesus says he'll come as a thief, he's in a sense saying there's some calculation to this. And I'm going to come when you are most vulnerable. You won't know the hour nor the day, but the thief will know. And the thief knows where you keep in your heart, in your mind, in your soul, all the important things of life that get you up in the morning, that orient you toward a life itself, family, friends, career. God won't send you the registered mail. Jesus will come to us like this thief. And all we're expected to do is just kind of be on the lookout. Because it could well be this week. You'll be about your work. And at some moment, you're going to be asked in the course of events to declare your discipleship, to whom you'll be faithful, to whom you'll be loyal. You'll have to show respect for an enemy. You'll have to show love or consideration to someone that you've never befriended, or maybe don't even like. The early church was concerned about being able to identify the followers of Jesus from those who weren't. Much more so than Jesus was in a way. Jesus has chosen to live in the world that prefigures what God envisions life to be like in the kingdom. And he said, in the Gospel of John, he's recorded as saying, you can believe in me. And if you believe in me, you'll live a certain way. That is to say, not that you believe that Jesus is the Christ. I can say all day long, I believe that Jesus is the Christ. I believe that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee. I believe that Jesus was a very good man. I believe that Jesus was a prophet. Having said that, I'm just simply saying I believe that factually. But when you declare, when you say, I believe in Jesus, you're saying, I believe in him and the way he chose to live in this world. And therefore, belief in him means it's going to affect how I live in the world. So when persons were wondering about their own salvation, he said, you can believe in me. And that indicates a form of discipleship. But there are people out there in the world that aren't of this faith tradition. There are people who are agnostic or atheists who may not believe in God at all. And so he added another little sentence to that. He says, you can believe in me. That's one way to come to God. Or you can believe in the things that I do. So what does he do? Feeds the hungry, heals the sick, forgives sins, establishes relationships, tells us that we have to love our enemy. He crosses over ethnic and other community lines that bring people together out of reverence for life itself. In the end, to believe in Jesus or to believe in the things that he does, they almost become the same thing. When someone believes in the things that he does, you could be well looking at a Hindu or a Buddhist. And if that person is doing some of the kindest, most gracious things on this planet for other human beings, that's belief in what Jesus does. Or you can say, hey, I belong to this community of faith called Trinity. And because we are faithful in our discipleship and we don't want to encourage each other in that walk of life, I believe in Jesus. And that brings to you and me a kind of joy in our relationship that may or may not be known by those who believe in the things that he does. That's more solitary. But belief in him brings us into existence as a corporate body of Christ. And when we get up and move and visit wonderful people in Honduras, we go as representatives of this body of Christ. Either way, Jesus has sort of come into our hearts and minds like a thief in the night. He's staked us out. He knows where we keep our valuables, our treasures in our hearts. And he knows how and what to say to invite you and me into a kind of relationship that issues from belief in him as Christ or belief in the things that he does. So you and I, we're just left with keeping awake, to not keep this intruder out, but to let him in. He may well be coming to us like a thief in the night, but he's God's good thief, and he's come to set us free. In the name of the Father, Son,